The Fairies' Dancing Place by William Carleton. Lanty McCluskey had married a wife, and, of course, it was necessary to have a house in which to keep her. Lanty had taken a bit of a farm, about 6 acres, but as there was no house on it, he resolved to build one, and that it might be as comfortable as possible. He selected for the site of it one of those beautiful green circles that are supposed to be the playground of the fairies. Lanty was warned against this, but as he was a headstrong man and not much given to fear, he said he would not change such a pleasant situation for his house to oblige all the fairies in Europe. He accordingly proceeded with the building, which he finished off very neatly, and, as it is usual on these occasions to give one's neighbors and friends a housewarming, so, in compliance with this good and pleasant old custom, Lanty, having brought home the wife in the course of the day, got a fiddler and a lot of whiskey, and gave those who had come to see him a dance in the evening. This was all very well, and the fun and hilarity were proceeding briskly, when a noise was heard after night had set in, like a crushing and straining of ribs and rafters on the top of the house. The folks assembled all listened, and, without doubt, there was nothing heard but crushing and heaving and pushing and groaning and panting, as if 1,000 little men were engaged in pulling down the roof. "Come," said a voice which spoke in a tone of command. "Work hard. You know we must have Lanty's house before midnight." This was an unwelcome piece of intelligence to Lanty, who, finding that his enemies were such as he could not cope with, walked out and addressed them as follows: "Gentlemen, I humbly ask your pardon for building on any place belonging to you, but if you'll have the civilitude to let me alone this night, I'll begin to pull down and remove the house tomorrow morning." This was followed by a noise like the clapping of 1,000 tiny little hands, and a shout of "Bravo, Lanty! Build halfway between the 2 white thorns above the boreen!" And after another hearty little shout of exultation, there was a brisk rushing noise, and they were heard no more. The story, however, does not end here, for Lanty, when digging the foundation of his new house, found the full of a cam of gold, so that, in leaving to the fairies their playground, he became a richer man than ever he otherwise would have been, had he never come in contact with them at all. The Young Piper by Crofton, Croker. There lived not long since, on the borders of the county Tipperary, a decent, honest couple, whose names were Mick Flanagan and Judy Muldoon. These poor people were blessed, as the saying is, with 4 children, all boys. 3 of them were as fine, stout, healthy, good-looking children as ever the sun shone upon, and it was enough to make any Irishman proud of the breed of his countrymen to see them about 1 o'clock on a fine summer's day, standing at their father's cabin, with their beautiful flaxen hair hanging in curls about their head, and their cheeks like two rosy apples, and a big laughing potato smoking in their hand. A proud man was Mick of these fine children, and a proud woman too was Judy, and reason enough they had to be so. But it was far otherwise with the remaining one, which was the third eldest. He was the most miserable, ugly, ill-conditioned brat that ever God put life into. He was so ill-thriven that he never was able to stand alone, or to leave his cradle. He had long, shaggy, matted, curled hair, as black as the soot. His face was of a greenish-yellow color. His eyes were like two burning coals, and were forever moving in his head, as if they had the perpetual motion. Before he was a 12-month old, he had a mouthful of great teeth. His hands were like kites' claws, and his legs were no thicker than the handle of a whip, and about as straight as a reaping hook. To make the matter worse, he had the appetite of a cormorant, and the whinge and the yelp and the screech and the yowl was never out of his mouth. The neighbors all suspected that he was something not right, particularly as it was observed when people, as they do in the country, got about the fire and begun to talk of religion and good things. The brat, as he lay in the cradle, which his mother generally put near the fireplace that he might be snug, used to sit up as they were in the middle of their talk, and begin to bellow as if the devil was in him in right earnest. This, as I said, led the neighbors to think that all was not right, and there was a general consultation held one day about what would be best to do with him. Some advised to put him out on the shovel, but Judy's pride was up at that. A pretty thing indeed, that a child of hers should be put on a shovel and flung out on the dunghill, just like a dead kitten or a poisoned rat. No, no, she would not hear that at all. One old woman, who was considered very skillful and knowing in fairy matters, strongly recommended her to put the tongs in the fire and heat them red hot, and to take his nose in them, and that would beyond all manner of doubt make him tell what he was and where he came from. For the general suspicion was that he had been changed by the good people. But Judy was too soft-hearted and too fond of the imp, so she would not give in to this plan, though everybody said she was wrong, and maybe she was. But it's hard to blame a mother. Well, some advised one thing, and some another. At last one spoke of sending for the priest, who was a very holy and a very learned man, to see it. To this Judy, of course, had no objection, but one thing or other always prevented her doing so, and the upshot of the business was that the priest never saw him. Things went on in the old way for some time longer. The brat continued yelping and yowling, and eating more than his 3 brothers put together, and playing all sorts of unlucky tricks, for he was mighty mischievously inclined, till it happened one day that Tim Carroll, the blind piper, going his rounds, called in and sat down by the fire to have a bit of a chat with the woman of the house. So after some time, Tim, who was no churl of his music, yoked on the pipes, and began to bellows away in high style. When the instant he began, the young fellow, who had been lying as still as a mouse in his cradle, sat up, began to grin and twist his ugly face, to swing about his long tawny arms, and to kick out his crooked legs, and to show signs of great glee at the music. At last, nothing would serve him but he should get the pipes into his own hands, and to humor his mother, asked Tim to lend them to the child for a minute. Tim, who was kind to children, readily consented, and as Tim had not his sight, Judy herself brought them to the cradle, and went to put them on him, but she had no occasion, for the youth seemed quite up to the business. He buckled on the pipes, set the bellows under one arm, and the bag under the other, worked them both as knowingly as if he had been 20 years at the business, and lilted up Sheila Nagig in the finest style imaginable. All were in astonishment. The poor woman crossed herself. Tim, who, as I said before, was dark and did not well know who was playing, was in great delight, and when he heard that it was a little prechan, not 5 years old, that he had never seen a set of pipe in his life, he wished the mother joy of her son, offered to take him off her hands if she would part with him, swore he was a born piper, a natural genius, and declared that in a little time more, with the help of a little good instruction from himself, there would not be his match in the whole country. The poor woman was greatly delighted to hear all this, particularly as what Tim said about natural genius quieted some misgivings that were rising in her mind, lest what the neighbors said about his not being right might be true. And it gratified her, moreover, to think that her dear child, for she truly loved the whelp, would not be forced to turn out and beg, but might earn a decent bread for himself. So when Mick came home in the evening from his work, she up and told him all that had happened, and all that Tim Carroll has said, and Mick, as was natural, was very glad to hear it, for the helpless condition of the poor creature was a great trouble to him. So next day he took the pig to the fair, and with what it brought set off to Clonmel, and bespoke a brand new set of pipes, of the proper size, for him. In about a fortnight the pipes came home, and the moment the chap in his cradle laid eyes on them, he squealed with delight, and threw up his pretty legs, and bumped himself in his cradle, and went on with a great many comical tricks, till at last, to quiet him, they gave him the pipes, and he immediately set to and pulled away at Jig Polthog, to the admiration of all who heard him. The fame of his skill on the pipes soon spread far and near, for there was not a piper in the 6 next counties could come at all near him in Old Modrach Rue, or the Hare in the Corn, or the Fox Hunter's Jig, or the Rakes of Cashel, or the Piper's Maggot, or any of the fine Irish jigs which make people dance whether they will or no, and it was surprising to hear him rattle away the fox hunt. You'd really think you heard the hounds giving tongue, and the terriers yelping always behind, and the huntsmen and the whippers in cheering or correcting the dogs. It was, in short, the very next thing to seeing the hunt itself. The best of him was, he was no way stingy of his music, and many a merry dance the boys and girls of the neighborhood used to have in his father's cabin, and he would play up music for them, that they said use as it were to put quicksilver in their feet, and they all declared they never moved so light and so airy to any piper's playing that ever they danced to. But beside all his fine Irish music, he had one queer tune of his own, the oddest that ever was heard, for the moment he began to play it, everything in the house seemed disposed to dance. The plates and porringers used to jingle on the dresser, the pots and pothooks used to rattle in the chimney, and people used even to fancy they felt the stools moving from under them. But however it might be with the stools, it is certain that no one could keep long sitting on them, for both old and young always fell to capering as hard as ever they could. The girls complained that when he began his tune, it always threw them out in their dancing, and that they could never handle their feet rightly, for they felt the floor like ice under them, and themselves every moment ready to come sprawling on their backs or their faces. The young bachelors who wished to show off their dancing and their new pumps, and their bright red or green and yellow garters, swore that it confused them so that they never could go rightly through the heel and toe, or cover the buckle, or any of their best steps, but felt themselves always all bedizened and bewildered, and then old and young would go jostling and knocking together in a frightful manner, and when the unlucky brat had them all in this way, whirligigging about the floor, he'd grin and chuckle and chatter for all the world like Jacko the monkey when he was played off some of his roguery. The older he grew, the worse he grew, and by the time he was 6 years old, there was no standing the house for him. He was always making his brothers burn or scald themselves, or break their shins over the pots and stools. One time, in harvest, he was left at home by himself, and when his mother came in, she found the cat a horseback on the dog, with her face to the tail and her legs tied round him, and the urchin playing his queer tune to them, so that the dog went barking and jumping about, and puss was mewing for the dear life, and slapping her tail backwards and forwards, which, as it would hit against the dog's chaps, he'd snap at and bite. And then there was the filulu. Another time, the farmer with whom Mick worked, a very decent, respectable man, happened to call in, and Judy wiped a stool with her apron and invited him to sit down and rest himself after his walk. He was sitting with his back to the cradle, and behind him was a pan of blood, for Judy was making pig's puddings. The lad lay quite still in his nest, and watched his opportunity till he got ready a hook at the end of a piece of twine, which he contrived to fling so handily that it caught in the bob of the man's nice new wig, and soused it in the pan of blood. Another time, his mother was coming in from milking the cow with the pail on her head. The minute he saw her, he lilted up his infernal tune, and the poor woman, letting go the pail, clapped her hands aside and began to dance a jig, and tumbled the milk all atop of her husband, who was bringing in some surf to boil the supper. In short, there would be no end to telling all his pranks, and all the mischievous tricks he played. Soon after, some mischances began to happen to the farmer's cattle. A horse took the staggers, a fine veal calf died of the black leg, and some of his sheep of the red water. The cows began to grow vicious and to kick down the milk pails, and the roof of one end of the barn fell in, and the farmer took it into his head that Mick Flanagan's unlucky child was the cause of all the mischief. So one day he called Mick aside and said to him, "You see the things are not going on with me as they ought, and to be plain with you, Mick, I think that child of yours is the cause of it. I am really falling away to nothing with fretting, and I can hardly sleep on my bed at night for thinking of what may happen before the morning. So I'd be glad if you'd look out for work somewhere else. You're as good a man as any in the country, and there's no fear but you'll have your choice of work." To this Mick replied that he was sorry for his losses, and still sorrier that he or his should be thought to be the cause of them, that for his own part he was not quite easy in his mind about the child, but he had him, and so must keep him, and he promised to look out for another place immediately. Accordingly, next Sunday at chapel, Mick gave out that he was about leaving the work at John Riordan's, and immediately a farmer who lived a couple of miles off, and who wanted a ploughman, the last one having just left him, came up to Mick and offered him a house and garden and work all the year round. Mick, who knew him to be a good employer, immediately closed with him. So it was agreed that the farmer should send a car to take his little bit of furniture, and that he should remove on the following Thursday. When Thursday came, the car came according to promise, and Mick loaded it, and put the cradle with the child and his pipes on the top, and Judy sat beside it to take care of him, lest he should tumble out and be killed. They drove the cow before them, the dog followed, but the cat was, of course, left behind, and the other 3 children went along the road picking skihories and blackberries, for it was a fine day towards the latter end of harvest. They had to cross a river, but as it ran through a bottom between 2 high banks, you did not see it till you were close on it. The young fellow was lying pretty quiet in the bottom of the cradle, till they came to the head of the bridge, when hearing the roaring of the water, for there was a great flood in the river, as it had rained heavily for the last 2 or 3 days, he sat up in his cradle and looked about him, and the instant he got sight of the water, and found they were going to take him across it, oh, how he did bellow, and how he did squeal. No rat caught in a snap trap ever sang out equal to him. "Whilst, Alana," said Judy, "there's no fear of you. Sure, it's only over the stone bridge we're going." "Bad luck to you, you old rip," cried he. "What a pretty trick you've played me to bring me here," and still went on yelling, and the farther they got on the bridge, the louder he yelled, till at last Mick could hold out no longer, so giving him a great skelp of the whip he had in his hand, "Devil choke you, you brat," said he, "will you never stop bawling? A body can't hear their ears for you." The moment he felt the thong of the whip, he leaped up in the cradle, clapped the pipes under his arm, gave a most wicked grin at Mick, and jumped clean over the battlements of the bridge, down into the water. "Oh, my child! My child!" shouted Judy. "He's gone forever from me." Mick and the rest of the children ran to the other side of the bridge, and looking over, they saw him coming out from under the arc of the bridge, sitting cross-legged on the top of a white-headed wave, and playing away on the pipes as merrily as if nothing had happened. The river was running very rapidly, so he was whirled away at a great rate, but he played as fast, aye, and faster than the river ran, and though they set off as hard as they could along the bank, yet as the river made a sudden turn round the hill, about 100 yards below the bridge, by the time they got there, he was out of sight, and no one ever laid eyes on him more. But the general opinion was that he went home with the pipes to his own relations, the good people, to make music for them. Fergus O'Mara and the Air Demons by Dr. P. W. Joyce. All the different kinds of goblins that haunted the lonely places of Ireland in days of old, air demons were most dreaded by the people. They lived among clouds and mists and rocks, and they hated the human race with the utmost malignity. In those times lived in the north of Desmond, the present county of Cork, a man named Fergus O'Mara. His farm lay on the southern slope of the Ballyhoura Mountains, along which ran the open road that led to his house. This road was not shut in by walls or fences, but on both sides there were scattered trees and bushes that sheltered it in winter and made it dark and gloomy when you approached the house at night. Beside the road, a little way off from the house, there was a spot that had an evil name all over the country. A little hill covered closely with copsewood, with a great craggy rock on top, from which, on stormy nights, strange and fearful sounds had often been heard. Shrill voices and screams mingled with loud fiendish laughter, and the people believed that it was the haunt of air demons. In some way, it had become known that these demons had an eye on Fergus, and watched for every opportunity to get him into their power. He had himself been warned of this many years before by an old monk from the neighboring monastery of Botvant, who told him, moreover, that so long as he had led a blameless, upright life, he need have no fear of the demons, but that if he ever yielded to temptation, or fell into any great sin, then would come the opportunity for which they were watching day and night. He never forgot this warning, and he was very careful to keep himself straight, both because he was naturally a good man, and for fear of the air demons. Some time before the occurrence about to be related, one of Fergus's children, a sweet little girl, about 7 years of age, fell ill and died. The little thing gradually wasted away, but suffered no pain, and as she grew weaker, she became more loving and gentle than ever, and talked in a wonderful way, quite beyond her years, of the bright land she was going to. One thing she was particularly anxious about, that when she was dying, they should let her hold a blessed candle in her hand. They thought it very strange that she should be so continually thinking and talking of this, and over again she made her father and mother promise that it should be done. And with the blessed candle in her hand, she died so calmly and sweetly that those round her bed could not tell the exact moment. About a year after this, on a bright Sunday morning in October, Fergus set out for Mass. The place was about 3 miles away, and it was not a chapel, but a lonely old fort, called to this day Lissanafron, the fort of the Mass. A rude stone altar stood at one side near the mount of the fort, under a little shed that sheltered the priest also, and the congregation worshipped in the open air on the green plot in the center, for in those days there were many places that had no chapels, and the people flocked to these open-air masses as faithfully as we do now to our stately, comfortable chapels. The family had gone on before, the men walking and the women and children riding, and Fergus set to walk alone. Just as he approached the Demon's Rock, he was greatly surprised to hear the eager yelping of dogs, and in a moment a great deer bounded from the covert beside the rock, with 3 hounds after her in full chase. No man in the whole country round loved a good chase better than Fergus, or had a swifter foot to follow, and without a moment's hesitation, he started in pursuit. But in a few minutes he stopped up short, for he bethought him of the mass, and he knew there was little time for delay. While he stood wavering, the deer seemed to slacken her pace, and the hounds gained on her, and in a moment Fergus dashed off at full speed, forgetting mass and everything else in his eagerness for the sport. But it turned out a long and weary chase. Sometimes they slackened, and he was almost at the hounds' tails, but the next moment both deer and hounds started forward and left him far behind. Sometimes they were in full view, and again they were out of sight in thickets and deep glens, so that he could guide himself only by the cry of the hounds. In this way he was decoyed across hills and glens, but instead of gaining ground, he found himself rather falling behind. Mass was all over, and the people dispersed to their homes, and all wondered that they did not see Fergus, for no one could remember that he was ever absent before. His wife returned, expecting to find him at home, but when she arrived there was trouble in her heart, for there were no tidings of him, and no one had seen him since he had set out for Mass in the morning. Meantime, Fergus followed up the chase till he was wearied out, and at last, just on the edge of a wild moor, both deer and hounds disappeared behind a shoulder of rock, and he lost them altogether. At the same moment, the cry of the hounds became changed to frightful shrieks and laughter, such as he had heard more than once now from the Demon's Rock. And now, sitting down on a bank to rest, he had full time to reflect on what he had done, and he was overwhelmed with remorse and shame. Moreover, his heart sank within him, thinking of the last sounds he had heard, for he believed that he had been allured from Mass by the cunning wiles of the demons, and he feared that the dangerous time had come foretold by the monk. He started up and set out for his home, hoping to reach it before night. But before he had got halfway, night fell and a storm came on, great wind and rain and bursts of thunder and lightning. Fergus was strong and active, however, and knew every turn of the mountain, and he made his way through the storm till he approached the Demon's Rock. Suddenly, there burst on his ears the very same sounds that he had heard on losing sight of the chase. Shouts and shrieks and laughter. A great black ragged cloud, whirling round and round with furious gusts of wind, burst from the rock and came sweeping and tearing towards him. Crossing himself in terror and uttering a short prayer, he rushed for home. But the whirlwind swept nearer, till at last, in a sort of dim, shadowy light, he saw the black cloud full of frightful faces, all glaring straight at him, and coming closer and closer. At this moment, a bright light dropped down from the sky and rested in front of the cloud, and when he looked up, he saw his little child floating in the air between him and the demons. holding a lighted candle in her hand. And although the storm was raging and roaring all round, she was quite calm. Not a breath of air stirred her yellow long hair, and the candle burned quietly. Even in the midst of all his terror, he could observe her pale, gentle face and blue eyes, just as when she was alive, not showing traces of sickness or sadness now, but lighted up with joy. The demon seemed to start back from the light, and with great uproar rushed round to the other side of FERGUS, the black cloud still moving with them and wrapping them up in its ragged folds. But the little angel floated softly round, still keeping between them and her father. FERGUS ran on for home, and the cloud of demons still kept furious whirling round and round him, bringing with them a whirlwind that roared among the trees and bushes and tore them from the roots. But still the child, always holding the candle towards them, kept floating calmly round and shielded him. At length he arrived at his house. The door lay half open, for the family were inside, expecting him home, listening with wonder and affright to the approaching noises. And he bounded in through the doorway and fell flat on his face. That instant the door, though no one was near, was shut violently, and the bolts were shot home. They hurried anxiously round him to lift him up, but found him in a death-like swoon. Meantime, the uproar outside became greater than ever. Round and round the house it tore, a roaring whirlwind with shouts and yells of rage, and great trampling, as if there was a whole company of horsemen. At length, however, the noises seemed to move away farther and farther from the house, and gradually died away in the distance. At the same time, the storm ceased, and the night became calm and beautiful. The daylight was shining in through the windows when FERGUS recovered from his swoon, and then he told his fearful story. But many days passed over before he had quite recovered from the horrors of that night. When the family came forth in the morning, there was fearful waste all round and near the house, trees and bushes torn from the roots, and the ground all trampled and torn up. After this, the revelry of the demons was never again heard from the rock, and it was believed that they had left it and betaken themselves to some other haunt. A Fairy Enchantment. Storyteller Michael Hart. Recorder W.B. Yeats. In the times when we used to travel by canal, I was coming down from Dublin. When we came to Mullingar, the canal ended, and I began to walk, and stiff and fatigued I was after the slowness. I had some friends with me, and now and then we walked. Now and then we rode in a cart. So on till we saw some girls milking a cow, and stopped to joke with them. After a while, we asked them for a drink of milk. "We have nothing to put it in here," they said, "but come to the house with us." We went home with them and sat round the fire talking. After a while the others went and left me, loath to stir from the good fire. I asked the girls for something to eat. There was a pot on the fire, and they took the meat out and put it on a plate and told me to eat only the meat that came from the head. When I had eaten, the girls went out, and I did not see them again. It grew darker and darker, and there I still sat, loath as ever to leave the good fire. And after a while 2 men came in carrying between them a corpse. When I saw them, I hid behind the door. Says one to the other, "Who'll turn the spit?" says the other. "Michael Hart, come out of that and turn the meat." I came out in a tremble and began turning the spit. "Michael Hart," says the one who spoke first, "if you let it burn, we will have to put you on the spit instead." And on that they went out. I sat there trembling and turning the corpse until midnight. The men came again, and the one said it was burnt, and the other said it was done right. But having fallen out over it, they both said they would do me no harm that time. And sitting by the fire, one of them cried out, "Michael Hart, can you tell a story?" "Never a one," said I. On that he caught me by the shoulder and put me out like a shot. It was a wild, blowing night. Never in all my born days did I see such a night. The darkest night that ever came out of the heavens. I did not know where I was for the life of me. So when one of the men came after me and touched me on the shoulder with a, "Michael Hart, can you tell a story now?" "I can," said I. In he brought me, and putting me by the fire, says, "Begin." "I have no story but the one," says I, "that I was sitting here and that you two men brought in a corpse and put it on the spit and set me turning it." "That will do," says he. "You may go in there and lie down on the bed." And in I went, nothing loath, and in the morning, where was I but in the middle of a green field?